close, guys. All right, nice big smile over at the camera. Thank you so much.
If Australians love koalas so much, why are so many dying on our watch?
All coastal Queensland populations, as far as we know, are crashing. We also know that similar declines appear to be happening in northern New South Wales.
I often think to myself that, if we can't save koalas, then what can we save?
Could it really be true that we're bearing witness to the unstoppable decline of a beloved national icon? Welcome to Four Corners. Statistics can be deceiving, but what you're about to see leaves little room for doubt that koalas are in serious trouble in much of their natural habitat. They've fallen victim to a lethal mix of urban development, massive land clearing and disease. That's before you even start to consider the impact of climate change. Scientists estimate that in New South Wales over the past 2 decades, koala numbers have dropped by a third, and in at least one significant part of Queensland by as much as 80%. The crash is so severe that the federal government recently took the controversial step of placing koalas in New South Wales, Queensland and the ACT on the threatened species list. Even in Victoria, where the koalas appear to be flourishing against the trend, experts have warned that their future too is far from secure. It's a very real question now. With time running out, can we save the koala? Marion Wilkinson reports.
Mauled by dogs, hit by cars, or riddled with disease. Koalas beyond the help of any caring vet. In wildlife hospitals and shelters up and down the East Coast, koalas are now being euthanased in large numbers. Australia's listing of the koala as a threatened species is an admission of defeat described by some as a national shame.
We'll see well over 200 koalas admitted into our hospital this year, and yet it was only 5 years ago we were only admitting 25 koalas. There's been this incredible surge of koalas coming through, and it's really quite frightening.
The only reason that we've had to intervene at all is the states on their own have allowed the numbers to continue to go into free fall.
I know what to do, and so do many other people, but it's whether we're actually allowed to put what we know into practice to make it happen, or whether the cultural juggernaut that our society is just keeps rolling over until eventually someone wakes up one day and goes, gee, there's no koalas left on the East Coast. Weren't we silly?
There are few places where the development juggernaut rolls out as brutally as it does on Queensland's Gold Coast. Behind the 70 kilometres of golden beaches and glitzy high-rise, big tracts of eucalypt trees that once fed local koalas are right now being flattened to make way for the next Gold Coast satellite city. Here at Coomera, developers promise affordable housing and open space for growing families.
The reality was that probably 30 to 40% of the area that we had assessed already had development approvals in place. And so it was going to happen, and it was going to happen fairly quickly.
For Queensland's koala, this is ground zero. East Coomera is where you understand why the koala is a threatened species. Here, right now, their homes are being destroyed so we can build ours.
This would have been intact forest, quite mature forest when we did our work in 2007, and it's now been reduced to, probably 500, 600 square metre blocks with houses on them.
Six years ago, when East Coomera was already earmarked for massive development, Dr Steve Phillips was belatedly hired by the Gold Coast City Council to survey the area for koalas.
So, Steve, this is the spot, is it?
To the council's alarm, he discovered a rich habitat supporting 500 animals across Coomera and neighbouring Pimpamar.
It was very good koala habitat, and in fact it still is koala habitat.
Many koalas lived right here, smack in the middle of what will be the next big development phase, the town centre where Westfield is supposed to build a giant shopping mall.
What's to become of it?
Bitumen, concrete, shopping centres and buildings.
It was clear to Phillips that planning decisions made years earlier meant nobody would stop the development. The only option open to save the koalas was to move them out.
Despite the fact that we had presented a good body of very new information, it essentially amounted to nothing, apart from the need, obviously, to mount a rescue mission, because there was potentially going to be a large tragedy here.
The man the Gold Coast hired to head that rescue mission is John Callaghan, a passionate scientist who once worked with Phillips. Callaghan and his team have so far moved around 100 koalas out of the East Coomera development zone. Now they're preparing to move more, including some from this site where a residential estate with 130 marina berths is planned. This is an extraordinary and risky experiment called wildlife translocation, and it's fraught with stress for both the koalas and the scientist.
I would never want to see koalas moved out of an area again to allow a development to occur, because it's not the best outcome. But in a situation like this, where there's really the other alternative is to do nothing, to allow the intensive development to occur. We know, we've seen it up and down the east coast, what happens to the animals where they are displaced.
The distant jackhammering is a constant reminder of why we're all here. But catching a koala, even before you take away their home, is no easy job. This is Nita. She's been caught before and didn't like it. And now she's got a joey. The tree climber must use an adjacent tree tall enough to get above Nita and unfurl a billowing flag to essentially scare her into coming down.
Come on, little one. Come on. Come on, little one.
John Callaghan, armed with another flag, goes to the base of her tree to try and steer her into his bag.
Come on, girl. Come on, girl. It's a girl. Come on now. Come on. 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 In you go. It's a girl. It's a girl. It's a girl. Come on. Come on.
Yep. Yep.
It's not exactly koala whispering.
It was quite lively at the end.
Translocating koalas to make way for developers is usually banned in southeast Queensland. But there can be exceptions if it's part of a scientific research project on the translocation of wildlife. And that was the solution in Coomera, allowing the state government to grant a scientific permit to remove the koalas.
We're really looking at the science that underpins relocation programs, what we need to do to make them as successful as they possibly can be over a longer time frame. It's a massive project for us.
So all up, there'll be about 200 koalas moved out of East Coomera.
That's correct.
After Nita gets a shot to calm her, she's ready to play her part in this scientific project. On the edge of Coomera's community sports field, a mobile animal surgery and research lab is set up with the help of leading koala vet John Hanger. Under anaesthetic, Nita and her Joey first get a health check.
It's a little hand there anyway. It's about as much as we're going to see, I think.
Her paws are shaved to take blood tests. Then her eyes are swabbed for signs of chlamydia, a sexually transmitted infection widespread in Queensland koalas that can affect fertility.
We just finish off the last of her chlamydia swab tests at the moment, so some of those will run here today so that we make sure she doesn't have an active infection at either of her eyes or her urogenital tract at the moment.
The research and translocation project has been financed by the Gold Coast City Council, and it's proud of its solution to Coomera's koala problem.
We're here to be fair to the developers, and we're here to be fair to the koalas.
Mayor Tate.
Hi, Marion. How are you?
Good to meet you.
Oh, welcome.
Can you come and sit down?
Thank you.
For the busy new mayor of the Gold Coast, actually stopping the development of Coomera is unthinkable at this stage.
I mean, there's litigation and loss of their profit, and so it's not the solution that we don't want to fight with people. If the relocation is doable, and after monitoring these 100 koalas that the survival rates is good as per natural attrition, and that they're happy with it, then it gives me heart that we can continue on with that and without any conflict with the urban developers.
But translocation is fraught with dangers. Many Coomera koalas were taken here, 15 kilometres from their home to the Lower Beechmont Conservation Area behind the Gold Coast. 14 of those translocated koalas were killed by wild dogs.
Which has been a real eye-opener for us. It's been very sad to see that happen. It certainly wasn't anticipated going into the program.
The dogs have mostly been dealt with, but the deaths have raised questions over the Coomera project. And one of Queensland's leading koala experts is sharply critical of it.
Well, whether or not it's a genuine scientific project, I mean, it still is a Japanese scientific whaling approach to dealing with the problem of bad planning decisions over East Coomera. Now, you know, they've been coming down the track for a while, but it wasn't until very late in the piece that somebody said, whoops, there are a lot of koalas there, what on earth are we going to do about them?
It's a charge John Callaghan adamantly rejects.
We're giving them a really good chance now, and clearly it can work. It's not true at all to say that we're, just culling them and likening that to whaling, because we are giving them a realistic chance of surviving.
Translocation is not something I want to do. it's something that I'd prefer to do rather than leave them to die when the bulldozers roll or in the aftermath of the loss of their habitat. Because in effect, when we destroy their habitat, we're forcing them to move anyway. And I'm saying we should be doing that in a scientifically robust and valid way, rather than just saying, look, it's up to you guys. We've destroyed your habitat, now you find somewhere safe to live.
You only have to drive 50 kilometres from Coomera to understand the scientist's dilemma. When koalas try to live where we want to live, we usually win out. This is part of what's called the Koala Coast, southeast of Brisbane. People flocked here in the last 20 years, bringing with them their dogs and their cars. By 2004, local koalas were dying at a rate close to 300 a year just from being run over. Hundreds more were killed by dogs or driven out by development.
We're right in the heart of the Koala Coast here in Redlands, and it's one of the strongholds of koalas in southeast Queensland.
Koala researcher Sean Fitzgibbon worked with the local Redland Council to protect the koalas trying to hang on in the parks and remnant bushland after the houses appeared.
I spotted one earlier this morning, so we've got a young female in this tree right at the edge of the road here, hanging on in the edge of suburbia really.
And you're the one who can do the spotting, so you tell me where I can find it.
This one is quite concealed in the vegetation, but there's a young, it looks like a young female sitting on the tallowood branch up there.
Until the last few years, the koala population here was in free fall.
I like to think the koala won't be functionally extinct in the Koala Coast. I think despite that big decline, we still have significant large chunks of bushland that have been set aside as reserves, and I think koalas will always persist in those areas. It's the areas that aren't protected, and there's still a lot of that in southeast Queensland, where we're going to see continued declines.
The bleak statistics show koalas on the Koala Coast crashed by a massive 65% in the decade to 2008.
The population has absolutely collapsed from 6,000 to 7,000 odd animals down to a couple of thousand animals over a decade or less. It just can't keep going down at that rate. It means that there will be functional extinction of the koala unless that decline is stopped and then subsequently reversed in the next few years.
Do you have a crisis over the koala in Queensland?
Look, there is no denying that surveys in the mid-90s to surveys done in around 2008 on the Koala Coast in particular showed that the numbers of koalas declined significantly. What is encouraging, the most recent survey showed that the numbers have largely stabilised, and that does suggest that the policies that the government has taken and potentially the work that we're going to invest as a new government in terms of koala protection will see that stabilisation continue and hopefully turn around and improve.
No, the data don't actually show that. What the data show are that the really catastrophic rate of decline has probably levelled off to some extent. We won't know till the next survey of whether it's still continuing to go down, but at a slower rate.
Southeast Queensland once had a thriving koala population. But since 1997, koala hospitals here have recorded around 15,000 deaths. The state government was forced to list the koala as a vulnerable species in this region 8 years ago. And despite laws that protect koala habitat and funding to buy prime habitat, some is still being flattened for development, which was earmarked years or even decades ago. Why can't you stop it?
I think we have achieved an effective balance through the policy that we've adopted and that we're going to take forward. That is that the best koala habitat has been mapped, it's been set aside in strategic corridors, it's been site-specifically located, and it is protected.
What they claim is sufficient is a process where we've been heading down a track where if in Queensland you want to see a koala, you're going to have to go to a wildlife park. They've been going down a path where we won't find them in the wild over time. Now, that is not good enough. Absolutely not good enough. And yes, it does mean an extra layer of regulation, but that's why we have environmental regulation. And this is not some weird species that no one's heard of. You don't get more iconic than this one.
Now koalas in Queensland and New South Wales are on the National Threatened Species list. Canberra has the power to intervene. But Queensland is calling it more green tape.
The biggest impact in the federal government's listing is here in southeast Queensland, where we've already got a very stringent planning regime, where we've already got a very strict policy around koala protection. And what potentially we will see is a huge number of development applications that are assessed under our very strict guidelines, also having to go to Minister Burke and his department for their consideration.
In terms of how many will require a federal approval, the evidence so far where there's been one that's actually kicked into the federal threshold means that there's a bit of hyperbole in the arguments that the Queensland government's being put.
Because the federal listing covers all Queensland, it could also affect the state's huge mining expansion. These photographs supplied to Four Corners show how large swathes of koala habitat were flattened as mine sites many kilometres wide were cleared, leaving this koala literally hanging on for dear life. The good mining companies employ diligent koala spotters, but some are much less careful.
I guess the average person in the street has a view that these animals scamper away in front of the bulldozers and go and find somewhere else to live. But the cruel reality is that most of them die. Not necessarily immediately. Some of them, have limbs torn off and suffer horrific crushing injuries. Others will simply starve to death. Others will just be displaced and have no shelter.
The loss of koala habitat is not only culling animals in Queensland and New South Wales, it's stressing the survivors, and hundreds are being brought into koala hospitals.
Okay, Bungie, here you go, buddy. Excellent. Well done. All right, mate. Can we spin you around, buddy? Have a look at your leg. Hey.
Michael Pine has been a vet at the busy Currumbin Wildlife Sanctuary Hospital on the Gold Coast for over a decade.
All right, mate, well done. So have a look over the rest of your head.
While Bungie here has a leg injury from being caught in a fence, Dr. Pine is these days seeing many koalas struck down by disease.
I think there's been a trend over the last 2 or 3 years where we're seeing more and more disease. We're certainly still seeing these koalas come in, being hit by cars, being attacked by dogs and these trauma-related ones. But we're certainly seeing more disease, as a percentage, and more advanced disease.
A whole lot of ecological reasons.
Vet John Hanger is now researching a retrovirus common in koalas. Contentiously, he argues it could also be one of the triggers for the high disease levels.
One of the major worries is that we see so many ill koalas in Queensland and New South Wales. We haven't definitively been able to blame the retrovirus. Certainly there's a swag of circumstantial evidence. But clinically, we see leukemia, which is very similar to childhood leukemia in human children. We see a range of bone marrow disorders that cause the koalas not to produce red and white blood cells. And we also see a condition like AIDS in humans in that the koalas' immune systems don't seem to work properly. They die from infections that they should be able to resist.
Whatever the role of the retrovirus, high levels of koala disease are also being blamed on stress caused by the loss of their habitat.
How exciting! All right, this is like the most exciting thing I've ever done. Got it, thank you.
At Brisbane's famous koala sanctuary, Lone Pine, few of the tourists realise the struggle now underway to make sure koalas will also survive in the wild.
Awesome. Thank you Fantastic. So much. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm a tree.
But this special place is itself a tragic reminder of how easily we can push the koala to the brink of extinction. Today, koalas are threatened by development and disease, but last century it was the hunter's bullet. It's only recently I discovered that this sanctuary was set up in the aftermath of one of the worst wildlife slaughters in Queensland's history. It was called Black August in 1927, when the Queensland government declared open season on the koala. It created an outcry all over Australia, and especially here in Queensland, where it helped topple the Labor government. The koalas were slaughtered for their fur to make Stetson hats and ladies' gloves, and some 600,000 pelts were collected in that 1 month. But early last century, it wasn't just in Queensland where hunting was rampant. In Victoria, the koala fur trade almost wiped them out, leaving only a few pockets of survivors. The strange story of how Victoria brought its koala back from the brink can be found over on a quiet island in Western Port Bay, 60 kilometres southeast of Melbourne. The only way you get to French Island is by ferry, and that's the way some locals still like it.
My great-grandparents, there was the salt industry, and collecting of seagrass went through the four generations.
Lois Ayres remembers the story of how the first koala joeys were brought to French Island in the 1890s, when the animals were being slaughtered on the mainland. Can you give us the romantic version?
Yes, that they were a present for a lady. A man sort of wooing a lady brought the first two over, and so that started off the koala population.
Because the koalas arrived as joeys, they were free of chlamydia, the sexually transmitted infection many believe controls koala populations in the wild. Disease-free, the population boomed, and being twice the size of their northern cousins, they ate themselves out of a home.
Local people lobbying governments to have koalas taken away, just so you didn't see starving koalas, skinny koalas. Dad said he'd rather shoot them than see them not being able to find enough food.
The solution to the over-browsing, as it was called, was to start translocating the koalas to other islands and state parks on the mainland.
Clear the area.
And so from a handful of French Island joeys, Victoria was repopulated with koalas.
This has been a huge wildlife translocation program that's gone on for literally 90 years, and more than 25,000 koalas have been removed from patches where there were too many koalas and placed into mainland habitats where there were fewer koalas or none. And in that way, over that 90-year period, we've repopulated Victoria with koalas, and pretty well now all the potential koala habitat in Victoria is occupied by koalas.
Is this one of the trees that you were talking about in here?
Yes, yeah. Fortunately, some of it's still alive, but most of it's been destroyed by koalas keeping on eating it as one of their favourites.
Parks Officer Scott Coots has been working on French Island for over 2 decades. He's proud of the operation here that gave Victorians back their koalas. But when you manipulate nature for almost a century, it can have profound consequences. The French Island koalas in time overpopulated some of the parks on the mainland and the other islands, and they began to starve again. The Victorian government, anxious for a solution to the overpopulation, began experiments in surgical sterilisation. But these were stopped after some terrible death rates. It settled instead on implanting female koalas with contraceptives.
This is the actual, it is called a trocar, or implanting needle. That implant is inside that. Once the small incision's made, the vet then pushes that through, and it's all done all sterile. This one has been out of the packet for a while. And then that goes and sits inside the koala. With the anaesthetic machine, they can basically be released within an hour or so.
But last October, after they were translocated to bushfire-affected parks on the mainland, some female koalas were found starving or dead. Earlier this year, the Victorian government quietly suspended its translocation of koalas from French Island.
Most recently, just last spring, there was a number of animals that were found in a compromised position after release, and they've been taken into care.
Do you think that has an impact on the government with ending the translocation program? Or do you think it's... Yeah.
I mean, we don't want to be involved in any management that causes stress and harm to wildlife.
The females seem to really be debilitated, and they are not lactating for their joeys.
Colleen Wood is a long-time koala carer in Victoria's Gippsland. She began sounding the alarm last year when koalas translocated from French Island began arriving at her shelter.
She's from French Island?
She is. She's a translocated koala from French Island to the Bunyip State Park.
And what condition was she in when you got her?
She was quite anaemic. She was malnourished. She was fully vet assessed before she actually came to the shelter here and underwent some intravenous fluids. And now we've just been feeding her up a bit and getting her back on track.
Did she have the hormone implants?
She did. She actually had 2 hormone implants.
Are they still there now?
We've actually taken them out of her to get her back on track, and we did that with the consent of the DSE.
The department?
Because we had some issues with it.
But Colleen Wood is worried about a much bigger problem. Apart from a few isolated populations, nearly all Victoria's koalas go back to the tiny gene pool on French Island. And she believes she's beginning to see serious signs of long-term inbreeding, including genetic abnormalities.
Tell us what's wrong with Miley. Can we have a look at her?
Yeah, we can. I'll actually grab her because she's fairly resilient.
Ooh.
She actually came in as a joey. She's quite bigger now, but you can see the marked differences with her. Her eyes are quite pinny. She's got very rounded face. You feel her lack of muscle tone, even though she's in this pen. Like, she's just... And a koala of this size, you shouldn't be able to pick up. Like, you know, she should be quite flighty and have some fight response, but she isn't showing.
And what do you think's going on here?
Oh, it's definitely genetical issues. Like, these guys were actually translocated from French Island onto the Sandy Point area, and I believe the population crashed in the 80s. And the genetics are just, you can see, like, they're not good. They're not good. These animals do not thrive.
Right now, the Victorian government believes their koalas are widespread. But there's serious questions over how the inbred Victorian koala will adapt to future threats. And the most deadly of these, say the experts, is likely to be climate change.
We've got a lot of koala populations across the state that seem to be fairly stable, but we don't really know. And given climate change, I think that's the big unknown in all of this. So yes, it's very possible that things could flip over and populations decline in future.
To understand the terrible effect of extreme temperatures and drought on koalas, we travel to the township of Gunnedah in northwest New South Wales. Gunnedah proudly claims to be the koala capital of the world. Amazingly, koalas thrived here, even while their numbers collapsed by a third across New South Wales. That was, at least, until a deadly run of heat waves in 2009.
This was some of the least productive soil on the place, and basically decided to turn it back into a habitat for wildlife and koalas.
John Lemon and Dan Lunny from the New South Wales Environment Department were carefully tracking the koala recovery in Gunnedah. It came about after local farmers were encouraged to plant koala-friendly eucalypts across degraded farmland.
We'd been radio tracking here for 2 years by this stage. We'd never seen this before.
But in late 2009, John and Dan began to see many koalas dehydrated and dying at the base of trees.
There was a period in late November, then December, where the temperature day after day in the drought was over 35, over 40. And so if there's no moisture in the leaves, no moisture in the ground, the koala's sitting at the bottom of the tree. That's not unusual to see koalas at the bottom of the tree. What's unusual is when you go up and you spray the water on the nose of the koala and then it reaches out for you. A wild koala reaching out for help.
At this tree near the local research centre, Dan Lunny captured on camera a remarkable record of the impact of those extreme temperatures. He and John had pulled up to help a severely dehydrated koala.
She was just literally limp at the bottom of the tree, and her head popped up as soon as she heard the vehicle, but didn't move. I was spraying her initially, and then as soon as she felt that moisture on her face, she came to seeking the source of the water.
But you could feel those
little
little claws there.
She'd actually penetrated my skin, and there was a few little droplets of koala-induced blood and mayhem. But anyway, no, she was just desperate.
You can see she still looks utterly exhausted in that picture.
It looks like a tame animal, doesn't it? That's a wild animal.
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect that at all. If you walked over to a koala, you wouldn't expect to be able to walk over and take a photograph close up. It'd be up the tree, around the tree, into the leaves. So this tells us there is a crisis for this koala. And when we saw it, property after property, we knew we had a crisis across the landscape. Our estimate from our own koalas we were studying, from the koalas we saw and on the farms when we were talking to farmers, was about a quarter of the population died over a few weeks. The other consequence was that the chlamydia, which was just present in the population but only by sampling, tissue samples, but it wasn't clinically evident, became manifest the following year, and the percentage rose to about 30% of the population, which means that those females won't be breeding, not in that they'll be in distress and a sexually transmitted disease, so it could increase. So not only is the death rate increased, but the birth rate is decreased. And that is a combination which pushes the population down.
We know the natural cycle of flood and drought creates great booms and busts in wildlife populations. But what worries scientists is whether frequent bouts of extreme temperatures brought on by climate change will completely drive out local koalas from some areas.
Koalas don't live underground. They can't fly away. They can't hibernate. They're sitting in the top of the trees, so if there's going to be a scorcher day during a drought, they're going to feel it. What every animal wants is to survive each particular day. So even if the temperature rises 1 or 2 degrees, that's not the issue. The issue is the increasing frequency of very hot days in a drought, and that's the crisis for koalas when you're in the western half of their range in New South Wales and Queensland.
But the Gunnedah study also gives hope for the future. Getting the farmers and the community replanting the local landscape with koala-friendly trees does make a big difference. Not only do they bring back koalas in good times, but they can also offer them some protection during the bad times.
The trees that are important are the trees next to the gully lines that have got deep roots that are taking up moisture even in drought conditions. So it's those trees that are crucial refuges during the most intense periods of drought with heatwave.
So this is Oki, one of our little boy koalas. He's about 18 months of age.
Savannah.
2 months?
Yes, please.
With his spoon nose and fluffy ears, the koala is Australia's most loved native animal. A draw card at every wildlife park and zoo.
Yes. Thank you, guys. Do you want to give him a cuddle, Savannah? Gentle. Oh, that's so
Good girl.
Good girl. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
But our challenge is to ensure the koala will survive not just in sanctuaries, but in the wild.
Until we apply the basic principles that we all know about that apply to this animal, leave its food trees alone, keep the dogs away from them, keep the roads and the cars away from them, and just let them live in peace. And find that balance between enough land for them, enough land for us, then we'll have a balance.
But until now, when it comes down to their homes or ours, the balance is usually tipped against them. For scientists like John Callaghan, preparing koalas to be taken from their home is not a task he enjoys.
Look after yourself.
Tonight, at least, he can take Nita home.
So we're just going to put her in this little tree right there. Just there.
But only until the developers are ready to roll.
Now she's going to get upset.
It's the classic environmental dilemma, how best to find a middle ground that serves human priorities while protecting the fundamental cornerstones of the natural world. We've got plenty more material on our website, that's fourcorners.abc.net.au. Until next week, good night.